Okay. So good afternoon. We are today going to be covering the subject of handling breaches and subject access requests. There will be some time near the end of the session for you to ask any questions. We are covering two very complex subjects, but coming at it from a very practical angle. So if I can ask you to just store your questions until about 10 to 1, where you'll have an opportunity to use the chat box to share your questions with us, and we will use that time wisely to respond as appropriate. So my name's Kelly Peters. I am joined today by Sally White and Sarah Stevens. I will let them introduce themselves to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Stevens. I'm going to introduce us both. I'm one half of Sylo Associates. We're an HR consultancy based in Oxfordshire. Been working with Kelly through Data Basics for a little while now. We support large and small organisations, all aspects of HR, and have got many, many years worth of experience in public and private sector.
So I wanted to start off with a bit of a fact. And I think it's quite an important one, is that 47% of consumers consider turning into a competitor in the event of a company losing control of data privacy. And I'm sure any of you that have been subject to the news in the last 12 months will have seen a number of things that have happened in the press. And what I want you all to think about, regardless of your size of organisation or the type of organisation, whether you're a small business, large business, or a charity, is the impact that a breach would have on your customers, on the people that are fundraising for you, and whether or not they would decide to step away from you as an organisation because they no longer trust you to use or to manage their information. So I think it's very useful that we briefly cover what is a personal data protection breach. And I want to emphasize that a breach is a security leading to the destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure or access to personal data. It's not just about losing information. We typically hear in the press about hacked data. But the story that I've got on this page is about a fact that a nurse misused her privilege of accessing sensitive medical records to look in and be inquisitive about particular individuals. Now, she accessed, of the 3,000 files she accessed one file 500 times. Now, the hospital was able to determine that because of audit controls, but she was also dismissed from her role and she was taken to court under the Data Protection Act of 1998 and found guilty of the act and was penalised. So it is not just about the big loss of information, it's also, which is why we've got HR professionals here today, is that individuals within your organisation could have a momentary lapse and access information and misuse that information that could then lead to a breach. So it's worth touching on some of the breaches that have happened. I'm sure that you may be able to name a few more than me. I've got here about the Heathrow incident. There was a USB stick with the Queen's security details found on a road in London, unencrypted. The individual accessed the file and then clearly made it known that they had the USB stick. That could have had any information on it, and I want you to think about how easy in your organisation it would be to lose a USB stick, especially if it contains highly sensitive information. It's very typical that in some organisations where people are unhappy or they feel that the data that they have captured over their lifetime within an organisation belongs to them, so they will download a copy of that data and they'll take it with them to their next organisation, which is the example of a former recruitment consultant. Again, that individual was a breach of contract as well as in breach of data protection and was found guilty. We've then got Morrison's. Morrison's is a massive case that we will still continue to see the ramifications from, but this was very much a disgruntled member of staff who had highly privileged access to information that then decided that they were going to upload almost 100,000 records of staff to the web. And we will cover this in a little bit more detail later on. So I want to talk to you very much about practical elements. I want you to think about, if someone comes up to you and says, I think we've had a breach, other than panic, which is my picture here depicting, what would you do? What would you think to do? What would be your natural reaction? So this is what I want to talk about today. If any member of staff, or if you think, oh my Lord, we've had a breach. So it's very important that somebody in your business, it doesn't matter how small it is or how large, there is someone that's going to lead the investigation for your organisation. You must have a point of contact. If someone in your staff, if it's a receptionist, if it is someone that runs a help desk function, if it is a senior manager, they need to be able to turn to somebody to be able to tell them they've had a breach, so that lead investigator can then take action. So my first point for all of you to make a note of is, if you don't have someone who is identified as leading data protection breaches in your organisation, consider who that person could be. And whilst I am joined here today by HR, don't necessarily think it will be a HR responsibility. Yeah. It could well be a combination of people, and Sally and Sarah may agree or disagree.
Yeah, very much so.
That it may be IT, HR, marketing, depending on what the breach is. And most importantly, let your staff know. So if you have a breach, someone should be identifying it. And if you don't know who that is, identify a lead person. Now, it may sound like a really silly question, but is the incident a personal data breach? So we want to be able to know if personal data, as defined by the data protection regulation, and sensitive data, because they are slightly different, have been affected by a loss of a data stick, by a stolen laptop or mobile phone for that matter, for an email being sent to the wrong person with an Excel attachment, to a phishing email being opened and accidentally downloading malware data onto your computer, or you've had a database that's been hacked. So the first thing you really want to do, once you know who's going to lead the investigation, is see what's been affected, what data is contained on the file that has been lost, stolen, or accessed for that matter. So I've got two examples. The two examples here are one of where it is most definitely a personal data breach, and one that I'd argue is not. So the first point is your employee database has been hacked and could have a severe impact on the private lives of your staff. Think about what you have in your employee database. Now, this may be an Excel spreadsheet, it may not be a database, it may be one of the two. But what information would you have on your employees? You may have their next of kin, you may have their bank details, you may have information about their health, you may have information about disciplinary, you'll have their details about their national insurance, their passports. And you potentially have a significant wealth of information about an individual on a database that, if it's hacked, would be a significant breach. However, conversely, the second example is you send an email to individuals with a list of business email addresses to one client. The impact is minimal because all you've released is an email address. Now, there are a few examples where newsletters have been sent out and you've inadvertently disclosed information, but this is very much simply sending out a list of email addresses of business contacts. So the impact is low, and that's quite important when we think about whether or not we need to report this to the Information Commissioner. So you won't know who's leading your breach. You identified that it is a breach of personal data. So what you really now need to be thinking about is what personal data has been compromised. You need to be thinking about, is it credit card details? Is it passport information? Is it health and medical records? Is it religious or political beliefs? or any number of other personal data. If you recall in August, where British Airways had their breach, it was only over a small window of time, but the message that they sent out to everybody was information has been breached, but no credit cards. So they, at that point in time when they made the notification to the public, was they were aware of what information had been compromised. So your stance is to really understand what's been affected and just how many records are you actually talking about at this moment in time. Now, the number of individuals affected is an interesting question, because if you have one record, for example, and you have disclosed information on a vulnerable adult to an individual, so for example, a case of separated parents and child, and you inadvertently disclose the information of where the child is located to the other parent that isn't allowed to have access to that information, you have potentially put that individual in a position of physical harm because of that simple one release of information. So the volume of data isn't what triggers whether or not you report information to the Information Commissioner as part of a breach. It really is what will be the impact of the individual's rights and freedoms on that breach. So are you going to cause emotional distress, for example? So a clinic in West London sent out a newsletter of which they put everybody in the CC box, and as part of that they disclosed that everybody was in attendance at a HIV clinic, some of which had been diagnosed with HIV. So the emotional distress of that was very high. They also felt that there could be room for discrimination, because everybody else on that list now realised that they were attending that clinic and may have wrongly assumed that they are a patient of that clinic. Are you going to cause financial harm? So if the information that you have is all of your clients' credit card details, or all of your customers' credit card details that have been hacked, what's the potential risk of future financial harm to those individuals? Things that you need to consider. And then the physical harm, and hopefully there are a lot less incidents that could be a cause of physical harm, but these are the factors that you need to consider when looking at your breach. So think about, in terms of learning from this, whilst you're living this breach, what you want to think about in the future is where are your different data, and if you were to have a breach, what would be the impact in terms of distress, discrimination, financial harm, and physical harm, because that will allow you to put necessary measures in place to hopefully prevent future breaches. So I want to talk about containing the breach. Now, these are very technical kind of ways of containing a breach, and I'll ask Sally and Sarah to join in a second when we talk about from a HR perspective. But when you have, if a computer has been infected by a virus, you want your IT department to be able to isolate that computer and take it off the network, so you minimize the risk. So think about the NHS and think about the ransomware attacks that were happening. You want to minimize the impact that this breach is happening. If you've lost a mobile phone, and the London Underground state that over 25,000 mobile phones are lost every year, typically on a Friday or Saturday night, because you've had one too many drinks. But what's the possibility of being able to change your PIN code, to be able to remotely wipe the laptop or the mobile phone, or changing passwords to systems? And that's a very important one when we're thinking about potentially internal breaches that have happened that have caused by staff. Think about halted network. You're being attacked from an external individual. So I want to ask Sally and Sarah, from a HR perspective, if you're approached and a member of staff says one of our staff has deliberately downloaded information, they are leaving the organisation, they've deliberately downloaded all of the employee information, how do we prevent that from happening? From a HR perspective, what would be a practical piece of advice that you'd want to give people on the phone?
Well, I think as a first instance, as an organisation, it's probably right to have an idea of what HR measures you would need to put in place anyway. But you need to understand the context of what's actually gone, the content potential of what's been gone. You mentioned earlier about the investigation and really understanding what it is that might have actually been breached. It really is about how swiftly you can respond and to whom that the initial query needs to go. So it's about containing as quickly as possible by getting the right people involved as early as possible. But from a wider organisation perspective, there needs to be an understanding of what those measures would be. So what's the impact? What disciplinary approaches or actions might be taken if something does happen?
I mean, we've had clients where we've had this happen, and when they've done that immediate investigation, they've sought advice from us, and we will support them in suspending the employee where that's been appropriate, removing access. And often those discussions have led to them recognising there's been perhaps too much reliance on one individual and not enough audit involved in that. So sometimes the investigation can unearth some really proactive and practical steps that I think Kelly's touched on, so that you avoid that sort of thing happening again. I mean, certainly Morrison's will have taken plenty of learning around the amount of access that was given to one individual. So I would always look at it from what do we have to do from a sanctions perspective and a disciplinary process, but actually what learning can we take from this? I think, And
I think that's a really good point, and leads us on to the practical tasks, because you may find that the breaches that you have may never need to be reported to the Information Commissioner, because when you've looked at it, you've actually had measures in place. So you have had encrypted software, you have had the opportunity to shut down computers and reduce the impact. But what do we learn from this? How do you keep a note of the breaches that have happened when they've happened, and how do you share that learning across your organisation, regardless of how large and small it is? I typically get asked, well, we have a breach policy, Kelly, and we've done some training on the staff, but how do we really know that in the situation of, oh my Lord, I've just accidentally sent a file to the wrong person? Incidentally pointed, there's a Coventry council that sent a file to a taxi firm that contained vulnerable children information. So imagine that you're in that position. You need to be able to note that that's happened, and you want to be able to record it because you're going to have to report it to your board. But how do your staff learn from that? Is it simply a practical task of checking? How often are emails sent to the wrong individual? And this is very much about culture. So if you have an organisation culture where there's very much a blame culture, a lot of individuals are going to feel very uncomfortable putting their hand up and acknowledging that they've accidentally made a mistake. Now, most breaches will be human error related, and whether they are intent on causing harm or not, they are triggered by an individual. So what we want to be able to do is understand our vulnerabilities in an organisation.
And obviously, as Kelly said, there will be some which are just literally human error, and it might just be that that individual immediately realises that they've done something, and they go to recall the email. They take that action on their email. The discussion on this question then is they still need to say that the situation has occurred.
Yeah, because what I would want, and when I talk to clients, it's like at team meetings, it's a great opportunity to say, we had this breach. This is what happened. This is how we found the problem to be. This is what we did about it. And this is now what we're going to do to change. Because you're only from those kind of errors will you actually learn from it. Because I saw something last night where someone boasted on social media that in 20 years they've never had a breach. And I would question that a lot, because having been in business for 20 years, I have seen a number of emails that have been sent to me with attachments, and I've been like, I really don't think I should have seen that, because when I open the attachment, because you will open the attachment, oh, I shouldn't be seeing this information. Now, I've had a number of those over 20 years, and I'm sure you that are on the webinar may well have experienced that. And have you found USB sticks? Have you lost your phone, your laptop? Laptops are slightly harder to lose, but it happens. Yeah. I want you to think about, in terms of practical tasks, if you're having to think about handling breaches, do you know how often employees open phishing emails? Now, what's a very common email at the moment is, here's an invoice, it needs to be paid. It looks genuine. It's no longer the Nigerian prince sending you an email to ask you for X amount of money. You're now getting very sophisticated, genuinely looking invoices that if you press pay, you may not get that money back. So do you test your employees for those types of phishing scams? Is it in any of your policies and your procedures?
We've had it. We've had it internally. I've had an email that looks like it's from Sally with a request to pay an invoice.
Yeah.
Now, that's not how we internally communicate financial information to each other, but actually it looks very genuine.
Yeah. And I think it's where it looks genuine, I think, is the real challenge that people face, because they are tempted to press the button, and then that could open you up to a whole level of new vulnerability within your organisation in terms of what they then have access to. You may not know how often laptops or mobile phones are misplaced, but think about that. What would be the impact of losing a laptop or a mobile phone? I've had examples of people phoning me up and saying, I've lost my laptop, Kelly. Or the most recent one was, they went to a networking event, left their laptop in their car because it was an evening event. It was at an office, so they felt their car was perfectly secure. Their laptop was stolen from the back of the car. And I'm like, okay. They then tell me that on there was their entire HR Excel spreadsheet. I was like, well, it wasn't encrypted, the laptop. It was very easy for them to have access to. There was no way that they could remotely wipe any of the information. They then had to notify people that their information has been made vulnerable. They've had to contact the information commissioner, all because they thought that storing their laptop in their car would be okay. So I want you to think about scenarios in your organisation where a simple task of, I'm going to the shop, I will leave my laptop in my car, is thinking, well, what's on the laptop? What's on the mobile phone? What personal information about your clients, about your staff is on that if it was to get into the wrong hands, could cause distress, financial harm. So one of the things I want to put to you on the webinar is, consider doing some drills, very much like the fire drill. The only way we really understand how to react to a fire drill is when the fire alarm, it's a test, but they're telling you where to go in the course of an emergency, where's your fire exit, where's the meeting point. So from a breach perspective, you may have a policy, you may have a log file where you can record what breaches are happening, but they may be of no use to you if your staff don't know in that instant how to react to it. So consider conducting a data protection breach drill, just to see how your staff would react. You may be genuinely surprised about some of the reactions that you get, and the learning, most importantly, that you'll get from that. But be open is my other point. Be open to staff telling you they've made a mistake and the impact that could have.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's some of the practical tasks that you should be thinking about when handling a data protection breach. If once you've conducted your investigation, you realise that, and your investigation needs to start pretty quickly, you realise you need to contact the information commissioner. By having all of those answers, who's investigating it, what was the breach, what was affected, what have you done to stop it causing any more harm, are all questions the information commissioner will ask you when you report that breach to them. So make sure that you do conduct a thorough investigation. So now on to an even more complex subject, and certainly what the information commissioner has found is that there have been a significant number of subject access requests now being sent to organisations, because individuals have got a greater awareness of how their information is being used, or in some instances misused. And I think all we need to do is draw on the Facebook investigations that really kind of kicked off almost this time last year, that hit Channel 4, that talked about how we're not even aware of how some of our information is being used, but how as individuals we have the right to know how our information is being handled, whether it be staff, and we're going to very much focus at the moment on staff subject access requests, that your customers have the right to know what information you hold on them. So I'm going to do a brief overview, and I'm going to hand over to Sally, who's then going to talk you through an actual real example of handling subject access requests. So it's important to note that today, under the new regulation, there's no charge for the subject access request. So under the previous Act, the 1998, an organisation could charge £10 for the access request. That fee has been removed, and you have to respond to this without charging. So where you do have reference to that in your policies, procedures, or your website, you will now need to remove it. You'll also need to make sure your staff are aware that they no longer charge. You can also make requests not just in writing, but you can make them in person. So someone could phone up over the phone, or they could walk into your office, go to the reception desk and ask for the information that is being held about them. When someone makes a subject access request, it's very unlikely that they are going to say, I'm putting in a subject access request. You may more likely get something like, I want my information. It'll be a lot less specific to, I'm putting in a subject access request. What I also want to be very clear about is that where you express your opinions in writing about a client or an employee, and they are in emails or they are in files, and you have named that individual, they are just as relevant as part of a subject access request as all the other data that you have. So I have seen a lot of very inappropriate comments on employee and client files, where the fault is, well, this is private, it's not going to be shared, but the client or the employee is alerted to the fact that there are some statements that are being made about them in writing, and as part of the subject access request, that information comes to light. So I would certainly urge everybody on the phone, when they are talking to their staff, or just when they're thinking about, really consider what you're recording and keep it as professional as possible. Even if you have an internal conversation about how you feel about an individual, consider how you record it. So I'm going to hand over to Sally, who's going to talk through a real example of someone saying, give me everything.
Right, okay, thank you, Kelly. So the example that we've had experience of is relating to a staffing issue, and very much where the employee was disgruntled. There was a disciplinary process and investigation that had taken place. A hearing had been convened, a raft of information compiled to support the case. 2 days prior to the hearing, the employee sends an email saying, I want effectively all the information that you hold on me. Words almost to that effect. So when we look at this slide here where it says, give me everything, I want everything, this is exactly what happened. And it was in that particular situation, people's emotions are heightened, the employee concerned, the hearing manager, who's also anxious about the disciplinary hearing that they're going to be responsible for managing. So there was almost a sort of flight, you know, that panic, what do we do? And so it was just let's just remind ourselves very practically what we are required to do when handling a subject access request. Think disciplinary process just separate for one moment. I think that actually put people at ease and they handled it appropriately. So here you've asked for all the information. Well, we can need to confirm that that's a subject access request. and then we can very clearly respond appropriately. In this case, there was no query about, is this individual a data subject. We knew it was an employee, but it's useful for you to see here there might be some validation that you would need to do in terms of driving license, passport, particularly if this had been a customer, for example, and a request made by the phone. And I think that is a distinction, isn't it? So that some organisations might face. So if we turn to the next slide, this then I think for you is what would you do if you were in that situation, and what did we advise our client to do? Well, actually we clearly confirmed it was a subject access request, and in doing that actually it gave the organisation 1 month in which to provide a response. But in the meantime we wanted the individual to qualify exactly what it is that they wanted, what type of information they were looking for. The employee had worked there for 6 years. Actually, the role that they performed meant that they could have appeared in multiple files and documents as personal data, handling the customer information, not just their personal file. So it was really important to get that narrowed down. And I also remember talking to the manager, him saying, well, do I need to now wait before we can proceed with the hearing? No, you've handled the request, you've put the onus and action on the individual, we proceed with the hearing. They were two separate issues, though it was always within the disciplinary process, the ability for the individual to say, here's information relevant to my case. And so the two separate paths sort of trundled along. So, it wasn't a case of one railroaded the other, and the organisation was able to respond. And it made them think, actually, okay, we didn't here in this particular case have to confirm identity, but it then made us start to think about, well, how, when that person comes back, what it is they wanted and where we would find that data, because there was quite possibly client data that would have to have been censored in some way, but still might have been relevant. So I take this as quite a really practical case. And I do think, it just shows how the human reaction can play in this situation. If you're thinking about it from the employee's perspective, but also if you were the manager having to sort of handle that particular case.
And I certainly think targeting the search reduces the amount of man hours that are involved in subject access requests, because a typical response is, well, 30 days is a good amount of time. Well, it's not really, when you think, if you've got someone that's been in place for 6 years, you think about the number of places that their information could be stored, whether it be in emails, databases, it could be on paper forms. The information could be in quite a number of locations. So I think it's important that if we can elicit from the individual what they want and from where, it will reduce the amount of time.
I also remember thinking back to that case, then turning to the manager, so the case was closed, we supported them with here's a template letter and then adjust and respond. But actually we took account of to help in future cases to create a subject access request form, which, as part of an employee handbook could be one of the really useful templates, and up front, well, actually, if that were to happen again, you'd have the form to direct the person. And so, that's an example of some learning for them as well.
And I certainly think for you guys on the end of the webinar is, if you get such a request as I want everything, if you take a moment to think, do you know all the different places where that individual's information is? Because if you do, you're in a much better position to start taking forward the request. Then I have no idea where this information is, because that will eat into the 30 days that you have. So really think about, as an action, where is all the information that could be stored on customers or individuals.
One of the other things that I think was particularly key in this instance was the way in which not only were we having to deal with the very practical, this is a subject access request, but actually the emotional, as Sally said, it felt very, very personal, because the organisation was not large. There weren't rafts of resource to be able to deal with it. So actually the wider impact on the business was quite significant. So the people who were at the senior level having to deal with this really felt very exposed. And it was about how we supported them as well through the situation.
And I certainly think you can't underestimate how much time these will take, and it will take you away from your day job. So be prepared for that. I think it's important that where you can narrow the search, that it's useful. So if there are things such as dates, so of the 6 years the individual worked, was it a particular date period that they were interested in? Because that then helps reduce the amount of time. It's still going to be a very complex response, but it helps. Think about, is there a particular conversation that you're looking for? Is there a particular file? So I had a conversation with a client the other day who works in the medical industry and had received a request from a solicitor for very specific files on an individual. Once they confirmed they had the right agreements in place to receive the information, it was a very specific, I want this file on this time frame, and it was easy for the individual to access. They don't always come that way. So don't, obviously we've talked about staff, but think about customers. If you were to get a request, and we've very much talked about possibly by email or by letter, but if you were to get a request from a client through your social media place, so say through Twitter or through LinkedIn or through, if you were to get a request, do your social media team or whoever's responsible for that in the direct messaging understand that they have received a subject access request. So in today's modern world, we have to consider the joy of social media. So, yeah,
it's a double-edged sword. Is how we describe that one.
The other thing I would think about is and I refer to it as the temp test. So if you're looking at manual files, if you were to send a temp to a filing cabinet to say, I want you to find these records, you give them an hour to find it, and if in that hour they can't locate the information that you've asked for, and it's clearly not in a structured format, so I would then say it's very hard for you to locate the information. Please don't take that in any shape or form as me advocating that you should have unstructured, disorganized filing systems, but it is a good test to see how easy it would be to find records. There will be potentially instances where you will have to disclose information to a third party. So as a parent, you may be acting on behalf of your child. As a solicitor, you may be acting on behalf of a client, and you are putting in a request to access information. You may, as part of that process, there could be the potential that you are disclosing information about other people. And typically you'll find in files that it's never as easy as just having these data subject's name and no one else is mentioned in that email trail or in that file. So you really do need to think about other information that is disclosed in any records that are part of a subject access request, and think about, should you be seeking consent from that other party to whether or not they are happy for their information to be disclosed. In cases in HR, if there is a dispute between two individuals, you may not wish to agree for your information to be shared with the data subject to say, I don't want them to know that it was me that made this complaint. If they don't consent, what will be your process for making sure that information is not disclosed? Sounds very easy, but if you have to redact or black out individuals' names, think that you've only got 30 days. It's taking you 20 days to find the right files. How long is it going to take you to go through those files to then remove the fact that you are not going to inadvertently disclose personal data of another individual to the requester? So be clear about what your practices are when it comes to redacting information, and be very clear that where someone has refused consent for their information to be shared with the requester, that you advise the individual of that. Now, at this point, you may be feeling slightly overwhelmed with just how much paper or electronic records that you have. So it really is now about confirming your response to the individual. So from the scenario you talked about, Sally, was you able to provide the information in electronic format, or was it a combination of paper and electronic?
It was, in this particular instance, a case of paper exercise, and it was supporting them. We had a template letter, we identified the areas, and then they attached the paper-based copies, and that was what worked best. And it was after the time period had been narrowed, just as you advised. It wasn't all 6 years, and we knew that it related just to their staff record, so that helped, and in relation to a specific thing. So it was very, the data was confined to paper-based, because it was, here's a copy of an email, or here's a copy of what's held on your file, and here's the information attached. We went through the process of checking if there was any third party involved, and that wasn't necessary in this particular case, partly because of the size of the organisation. But I think it was good that you've actually identified that as an issue, because there will be cases where that will be very pertinent and very sensitive, actually, and would cause organisations issues. So it may be, you know, in terms of pulling together a response, you might want to be taking some advice, somebody reviewing a draft before it goes. That certainly was our learning from that, and helping the organisation. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about pulling together your response, so you've found all the information, you've got it in electronic or in paper format. Now the individual has the right to say they want it all in electronic or they want it in paper format, so you need to bear that in mind. But you want your response, you want to be able to stipulate you are the data controller, you want to tell them what you've been processing on their behalf, what is the data, so is it employee records, is it a client file? What's the purpose of that? Is it, you know, to be able to manage their employment? Is it to pay their pension contributions? What is the purpose of your processing their information? If you've done and implemented GDPR and data protection appropriately, you should know what your lawful basis for processing is. So this shouldn't be too big of a challenge. Make sure it's legible. If you're using any coding systems, and I'm ex-NHS, where a lot of information is very coded, you have to provide a reference to what that code means, because it needs to be plain English, and it needs to, the coding systems need to be explained. So our simple checklist for you, so that when this happens, I think it's better to think when rather than it's never going to happen, is it a subject access request? Like Sally said, the first thing you want to confirm, is it a subject access request? Do you have enough information to confirm the individual is who they say they are? If it's a member of staff that you work with daily, you will not need to ask for their passport information, because you know they are who they say they are. But if you were to get a request, for example, from an ex-employee, you may, who hasn't been engaged with the organisation for some time, you may wish to validate their identity. Do you need more information? So there's nothing stopping you as an organisation going back to the individual, acknowledging their subject access request and asking if they have more specific details about what they want. Clearly be prepared for the fact that the individual may say, no, I want everything. It entirely depends on if they are happy, it's just a genuine, I want to know what you hold on me, or it's a disgruntled individual member of staff or client that really does want everything that you hold on them. Think about all the information be changed between receiving the request and sending the response. So it's important that you don't amend any of the data after you receive the subject access request, because you don't want to be manipulating the data. So if you are in the unfortunate position where there are comments in emails that are not as professional as you'd like them to be, you can't go in and delete those emails. They have to be, and the individuals mentioned, they need to be disclosed. Check to make sure that any data that you're sending to the individual doesn't disclose a third party. the reason I've got the next question, are you obliged to supply the information? There may be some exceptions where you don't have to. And from a HR perspective, if you're going through a redundancy process, you will be notified as part of that redundancy process that you are subject to all the rules and regulations around that. So as part of that management decision pre-redundancy, you wouldn't be receiving information that pertains to that particular query or anything that's legal privilege. So if you as a company are having a conversation with a law firm about an individual, those conversations are covered by legal privilege. Make sure you don't have any complex codes, and then easy does it, prepare the response. So it sounds quite a lot, but once you've gone through this checklist, you should have enough.
Yeah, I'm just stepping in actually. For those companies that have HR systems, we found that actually if we take ourselves back to the principles of GDPR, it's about transparency. Having a system that's self-service functionality where employees can go in and update their records. If you flip this round, if people can see what you hold on the system, actually that might minimise the number of requests that come in. They become accountable for the information, and that might be a bit of a take for some of you, that might be useful.
I think that's a very useful and valid point. I think very much like when we talked about breaches, I think there's some very practical tasks. And we've obviously done a very whistle-stop tour through breaches and subject access requests, but it's important to train your staff. Now, you may just want to do an awareness campaign across your staff to make sure that if they receive a subject access request, this is who it needs to go to. They may not need to handle it, but they need to know who it should be sent to. And then you may wish to do more detailed training with the staff that are actually going to handle this, so they understand what they have to look for, how they need to provide the information back to the individual. Make sure that you've got someone that's responsible for subject access requests. Again, if you've got a HR department, they may be happy to respond to the HR related subject access request, will be unable to help you with a client request. So that may be much better sitting with anyone that's in operations, or if it's just you as the business owner, you are responsible for it all, unfortunately. And very much like data protection breach drills, I would like to advocate testing. Once you've trained staff and you've got policies and you've got template documents in place, really test to see if it works. So send in a subject access request just to see how different departments will react to that. Are they aware there's a policy? Are they aware who they need to talk to? And if they don't take that as a negative, take that as a learning experience to say, okay, we need to do refresher training, or we need to, as part of team meetings, reinforce some of these messages. Is there anything, Sally, Sarah, you want to add in terms of practical tips for?
No, I think you're right. I think it would be a great idea to find out where you are, and then take the learnings from it and put in place what's necessary.
So we've got 10 minutes left on the call, on the webinar. So what I want to know is, do you have any questions for us? It has been a very quick whistle-stop tour, but here's your opportunity in the next 10 minutes to use the chat box to ask us any questions that you may have. And if any come through, that'd be fantastic. We're happy to answer. If not, we may finish the webinar a little bit earlier. So any questions about breaches or subject access requests? Okay. So whilst you're thinking about some of the questions, what are the typical things that from a subject access request on HR, that have you ever experienced any organisation not having one?
Not having a subject
so they've never had one.
Oh my goodness. I think some of our smaller clients haven't. I think that increasingly they're aware that this is on their radar.
Yeah.
So I think that for me to sit here now and say
that type of client never is a very short-lived window, Kelly. I really do. I think it's that whole people are much more aware. It's a bit like people making a complaint and a grievance, isn't it? Now people are more aware of their rights. We increasingly see that happen. So I think that's our experience, really, isn't it?
That's right. I think it's much more, as you say, people are aware that it's
there.
It's there, and it's a possibility, and that it's more likely when not if.
So I think we've obviously got a few takeaway messages for you. I'm not sure if there are any questions that are coming through, but certainly I think it really should be a matter of think about when it's going to happen rather than if, and really start considering what processes you're going to have in place in the event of you actually being subject to a breach or a subject access request. I think would it be possible to get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. So one of the questions that's just come through is, can you have a copy of the slides? I will circulate the webinar, so you'll hear dulcet tones talking you through the slides, and you'll have our contact details. But this was very much a very practical approach to handling these things. I don't want you to panic, because that's the first thing that people will do, is they will panic when this happens. But think now, you have an opportunity now, if you don't have anything in place, to really think about how you would handle both of these scenarios. Who do you need to get involved in your organisation? Work on it together and really get people to learn from this. So with that, there are no questions. So I want to just mention briefly, if you have any questions, you can contact us directly. Obviously, both my details and Sally and Sarah's contact details are on this webinar, sorry. And we will be doing another webinar next month. The focus next month will very much about HR, data protection and accountability, and how you and your staff can work together to build a culture where it's okay to learn from mistakes when they happen, because they will, sadly. I will send you details if you're interested of that webinar. So thank you for taking an hour out of your time to listen to us this lunchtime. I will close the session and enjoy the rest of your day.